Hi folks. So this is a video on the planet Jupiter. As we talked about a little bit in the previous video on Saturn, Jupiter is the principle of power, which includes expansive force and also includes equilibrium, which is kind of curious, but hopefully we'll get to the bottom of that in this short video on Jupiter. Whereas Saturn was focusing things, right, so that they could have some sort of foundation or structure, Jupiter is the sort of the out-breath that inspirits and gives life. Inspiration and inspirit are related words, and they are good words for Jupiter. So Jupiter is is kind of this initial breath of life. Things, when Saturn contracts, the in-breath, and Jupiter expands, the out-breath. Saturn deals with unity, and Jupiter is dealing with multiplicity, which is also perhaps why Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, opposite to Saturn's domicile, Capricorn. In Capricorn, we have the winter solstice, where we have the longest night, which night is reflective over inactivity, potentiality, and thus more toward unity. Whereas Cancer and the summer solstice, where the longest day occurs, is more reflective of multiplicity and activity and heat and light and things like that. So Jupiter at its core, it's really the principle of power, which includes expansion within it, right? It's not primarily, because expansion and contraction are a polarity. They are, in a sense, a false dichotomy that we use to understand this spectrum of energy. And you'll find in the Kybalion, in the Hermetic principles, that the law of polarity states the same thing, that really everything is just one spectrum, and then you have a relative, or you have extremes on that spectrum where you have relativity that's making it appear as a duality. So really, expansion and contraction are not fundamental things. They are just part of a spectrum, and they are relative. If you live in a giant mansion and then you move to a small shack, that is a form of contraction. However, if you lived in a yet smaller shack than the shack I just mentioned and moved into the original shack I mentioned, and the second shack is bigger, or sorry, the shack you moved to is bigger than your first shack or whatever, or your room, maybe you're renting a single room, then obviously that's expansion. So it's relative. It's not actually fundamentally real, just like heat and cold and many other dualities like light and dark as well. There's really no such thing as pure light or pure darkness. There's just the spectrum of energy and experience that we call light and darkness, but they are relative, right? An owl or a cat can see perfectly well in the dark, while a human cannot unless there's some moonlight or something like that, and so on. So it's honestly relative. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So the principle of power, just this raw power. And in relationship to this, let's see, where is it? No, that's not it. We're going to get into that in a moment. Here we go. This is sort of an artistic depiction of Muspelheim, which is a Germanic term for one of the 9 realms of the Nordic mythology, which is basically the realm of cosmic or primordial fire. And in the Nordic creation story, pretty much the first, it seems like roughly the first thing that happens for creation to occur is that there's this yawning void or giant cave type thing called Ginnungagap. That's a fun word, isn't it? Ginnungagap. And basically within that cave there emerges, or something like this, the 2 different spectrums, like extreme heat and activity, fire, and extreme cold and inactivity, or ice, which is called Niflheim, the realm of ice. And so these 2 realms sort of collide and give birth. And basically what happens is they collide, and it releases all this potential, and it releases like a steam almost. And the steam floats up to the top of this cave, this Ginnungagap, so to speak, and forms into like a rimey substance, like cave drippings. And then they drip together to form a giant called Ymir. And then eventually from Ymir, the universe is created. So I at one point did some work thinking about which planets would be associated with which realms of the Nordic tradition, and I felt like Muspelheim was most appropriate for Jupiter because it was more about this very expansive, enlightening sort of energy. And you might think, well, I thought Mars was fire, and I thought the sun was fire. And I would say that definitely you're not wrong. They are, absolutely. And especially the sun, which is literally a giant ball of fire. But the thing is that the juxtaposition in the nine realms made me realize that Saturn had to be Niflheim, the realm of ice and inactivity, and opposite that, Muspelheim had to be Jupiter because they are a pair in astrology, more so than Sun and Saturn are and whatnot. And if you think about the sun just is. It's always just burning as it is. And I know that, yes, it's going through different phases and cycles according to science, and that's important to keep in mind and all that, the sunspot cycle and the fact that, eventually it may turn into, like burn out, so to speak, and turn into some kind of like white or red dwarf or something like that. I don't actually know. You'll have to look that up. But so the point is, yes, the sun is changing and all that stuff, but the sun appears like totally consistent to us, right? And Mars too. Mars is not any sort of primordial fire or power. Mars is really more of like a personalized power. Mars is like a sense of power. Mars is movement and change and initiation. But Mars is not this cosmic power that leads to expansion and then equilibrium, as I see it and as I'm presenting it. So this is not really that complex to wrap your head around, but you have to remember that just because Jupiter would be associated with Muspelheim and this like sort of primal fire that helps bring things into being, doesn't mean that in a chart Jupiter is fiery. It's not like that. This is a cosmological principle that we're talking about, not an elemental one, because Muspelheim and Niflheim, they're represented as fire and ice, but they are not, or fire and water, if you will, but they're not fire and water as we know them in the 4 and 5 element theory, if that makes sense. So they're representative of these cosmic principles that come together to start forming the universe as we know it. And getting back to our Big Bang stuff, here's some images, which I mentioned in the previous video, the Big Bang. If this singularity is Saturnic, right, this condensation of density and matter and all this stuff, and then it explodes outward and becomes the realm of multiplicity, this exploding outward is the Jupiter piece of the thing, right? Here's an artist's rendition. Who's to say if it looked like this or not? It probably didn't quite look like this, but I like it anyway because you see this expansion, this power, this energy just shooting out of this center. So we're going from Saturn to Jupiter, right? In breath, out breath. It's the same as the days and nights of Lord Brahma in the Indian cosmology. So then this is just one more image I found, and it's supposed to depict something slightly different than the Big Bang. Is supposed to depict like that there were other universes before the Big Bang, which is probably true, and kind of reflects the cyclic nature of reality and reincarnation and stuff. But I just really liked it because, again, I saw it as like this center is Saturn, and then radiating out is the energy of Jupiter, what we represent as Jupiter. So I just like this image. Okay, let's get back to this. So yeah, before I launch into this, again, why is Jupiter equilibrium? Like, why am I saying it's equilibrium, and how does that come out of this principle of power? Well, if you think about it, for something to be powerful, right? For it to be raw power, so to speak, it has to always be in equilibrium with itself. That's what makes something truly powerful, meaning also truly stable. Power implies stability. It really does. If it's real power, that just has to do with, the natural inborn power that we all have and are all connected to, it has to be in equilibrium. Otherwise, it won't last. So it's really not powerful if it's exerting its will falsely over other people, right? Like a tyrant. And so on and so forth, like a bully. that's not real power. That's not real equilibrium. That's an imbalanced kind of power. That's basically the simplest reason. So I'm going to skip down to the Sufi explanation given here from Titus Burkhart's book. Al-Hima, which is spiritual aspiration in Arabic, Al-Hima signifies the force of decision, the desire to rise above oneself or spiritual aspiration. Thus, it is a quality of the will, which actually has to do with the sun more than anything, and not an intellectual faculty like Mercury, Saturn stuff. Nonetheless, it should be noted that by anticipation, spiritual will is intellectual. That's an interesting line. Nonetheless, it should be noted that by anticipation, spiritual will is intellectual. I think in the sense, well, I'll read on and come back to that, but from the point of view of realization, it is the most important and noblest faculty of man. Man is only truly man through his will to be delivered by ascending tendency, right, expanding ever more and more, pictured in his vertical posture, which distinguishes him from the animals. Al-Hima is also the faith that moves mountains. So by anticipation, spiritual will is intellectual in the sense that it does have something to do with the plane of the intellect and, of course, the mind wanting to ascend towards the divine, and the plane of the intellect being cold and all-embracive. So Jupiter can only expand within Saturn's realm, basically. If Jupiter expands beyond Saturn's realm, a disequilibrium occurs, right? Jupiter always has to, no matter how much we expand, we always have to remember our core foundation, like I talked about before, our skeletal structure, so to speak. If we don't do that, we can lose ourselves in the circumference of the circle, forgetting our center, so to speak. So Jupiter basically inspirits and enlivens things in life from a really primordial sort of fundamental place. It's a less personal planet because it moves slowly, and like Saturn, it's not. It doesn't really have to do with what we personally desire. It has, again, more to do with what's natural to preserving life, which is why it also represents children. And it basically, as we think about Jupiter, like great and good fortune is associated with Jupiter because, again, it's this enlivening principle that comes from the raw power that it represents. And of course, it is a gas giant, so it's actually almost a second sun, which is like a kind of a secret to Jupiter. It's like the other part of the sun. Some people have called it the higher octave of the sun, and it even exerts a pretty strong gravitational pull on the sun, from what I understand as well. Perhaps the only planet to really do that in the way that it does. So again, fundamentally, Jupiter is power, and it basically, its function in man is to bring us more in touch with our fundamental nature, which is the sun, represented by the sun, essentially. So I hope that was a helpful video on Jupiter. I am going to sign off now and perhaps expand upon Jupiter and the other planets another time, because I want to keep these videos short. But don't forget to hit like, subscribe, share these videos, please, and check out my website for individual readings and more. Okay, blessings to all.